The moment Thomas Reed heard the desperate cry echoing through the frozen woods, his heart stopped. A retired Marine should have feared nothing, yet tonight, something in that voice felt painfully familiar, as if the past he tried to bury had come crawling back through the snow. This is the story of a broken man who returned home searching for silence, only to find healing through a loyal dog, a wounded animal, unexpected strangers, and the quiet grace of God. Before we begin, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you love stories of hope, faith, and second chances. It helps this small community grow. Winter pressed its silence against the forests of northern Minnesota, the kind of cold that settled into wood, stone, and memory. Snow covered the narrow road like a white shroud as the old pickup truck crawled toward the outskirts of Cold River, its engine humming with the tired rhythm of a machine that had lived far past its prime. Inside the cab, Thomas Reed drove with both hands steady on the wheel, his breath forming faint clouds in the chilled air. At 65, Thomas was the kind of man whose presence filled a space before he ever spoke. His shoulders were broad beneath a thick Marine Corps jacket. His hands were scarred from years of service, and his jawline, though partly hidden under a neatly trimmed gray beard, still carried the sharpness of a soldier who once stared down the worst moments of war. His eyes were the part of him untouched by age. They held that steady, deep focus of someone who had seen too much, but refused to let it break him entirely. Beside him lay Duke, the old German shepherd who had served alongside him for more than a decade. Duke was 11 years old, powerful but mellowed by time, his coat a mix of charcoal black and warm gray. His ears twitched at every sound outside the window, but his amber eyes rarely left Thomas. Duke had always been the watchful type, loyal to the bone, a dog whose calm presence could steady even the most storm-fractured man. As the truck rounded the last bend, the forest split open to reveal a familiar clearing. At its center stood what remained of Thomas's childhood home, the cabin that had once been filled with laughter, pine smoke, and the soft singing of his mother on Sunday mornings. Now it was nothing more than a collapsed skeleton of wood, its roof sagging, its porch broken, its windows glazed with frost and abandonment. Thomas braked slowly, his breath catching for a moment as he stared at the ruin. He stepped out into the cold, feeling the crunch of snow beneath his boots. The air bit into his face, reminding him of the desert nights where the temperature dropped without warning. He stood there, motionless, while Duke jumped down and began sniffing the ground carefully, navigating the unfamiliar familiarity of the place. Memories washed over Thomas with the softness of falling snow. His father, Samuel Reed, a stern but gentle man with a square jaw and kind eyes, chopping firewood at dawn. His mother, Margaret Reed, whose warm smile made even the harshest winters feel less cruel. The smell of pine logs, fresh bread, and old books. And then the memory that always stopped him. Leaving. Leaving without a proper goodbye, without knowing it would be the last time. He had been too young, too angry, too determined to prove himself in a world far larger than Cold River. War had shaped him into steel, but it had also hollowed parts of him no one could see. "We are home, Duke," Thomas murmured. His voice was low, yet it carried a blend of sorrow and gratitude. Duke nudged his hand, gently, as if sensing the shift in Thomas's heartbeat. Thomas walked toward the cabin, pushing the sagging door open. The hinges groaned like an old man stretching bones stiff from winter. Inside, the dimness held remnants of the past. A broken chair, a fallen shelf, charred marks on the far wall, as if a stove fire had once gotten out of hand. Snow had slipped through the broken roof, covering half the living room. Thomas crouched beside the old hearth and brushed away a layer of ice. He found a rusted nail still wedged into the stone. His father had used that very nail to hang the family's Christmas stockings. A faint smile touched Thomas's lips, then faded into the quiet air. He walked deeper into the cabin, stepping slowly as if afraid the past might collapse beneath his weight. Duke followed, tail low but ears alert. The bedroom was the hardest part. The bed frame had collapsed, the dresser was tipped over, and pieces of old clothing lay scattered, stiff from decades of cold. Thomas picked up a small wooden carving from the floor. It was a horse, whittled by his father's steady hands. He remembered being 6 years old, watching Samuel shave curls of wood, while saying every man should create something soft in a world that was often too hard. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the memory settle inside him like a quiet ember. When he opened them again, the room seemed smaller, darker, and colder. He walked outside, unable to remain in the tomb of his childhood any longer. The sun had begun to sink behind the tree line, painting the sky in hues of lavender and pale orange. Duke returned to stand beside him, brushing against his leg. "We cannot sleep in there," Thomas said lightly, though the heaviness beneath the words was impossible to hide. He looked around the property and spotted the one place that still seemed intact: the old pickup truck. It was not much, but it had a working heater and a blanket in the back. It would do for the night. Thomas prepared the truck, placing his coat on the back seat as extra padding. Duke hopped in first and curled himself into a large ball of warmth. Thomas sat beside him, leaning back and letting exhaustion take him. The silence of the Minnesota wilderness settled softly around them. A lone owl called somewhere in the distance, its cry echoing through the snow-filled trees. Thomas placed a hand on Duke's fur. "We will rebuild," he whispered, "one piece at a time." Duke lifted his head and licked Thomas's knuckles, a silent vow that he would stay by his side for every step. As the night deepened, the snowfall grew heavier, tapping gently against the truck's windows. Inside that small shelter of metal and warmth, Thomas felt something he had not felt in many years. Not hope, not yet, but the faint tremor of possibility. And for a man who had lived through wars, both seen and unseen, possibility was enough. Morning arrived with a pale sun rising behind the trembling branches of the birch trees, its weak light spreading across the frost-covered ground. Thomas Reed woke inside the truck with a stiff neck and a lingering ache in his lower back, the kind that stayed long after a man's youth had gone. Duke lifted his head from Thomas's lap, stretching slowly until his paws tapped softly against the window. The old dog blinked at Thomas, waiting for a signal, an order, or simply a familiar rhythm to begin the new day. Thomas rubbed Duke's ears gently. "All right, partner. Let's get something to eat." The cabin still felt like a wounded memory, a place that needed time before it could truly be entered again. So he drove into town. As the pickup rattled along the icy road, the world outside remained quiet, save for the distant sound of crows cawing above the trees. Cold River looked smaller than Thomas remembered. Rows of snow-dipped roofs, a few old stores, a diner that still used the same neon sign he recalled from the 70s. When he parked near O'Malley's General Store, Duke stood alert in the passenger seat, watching as people passed. Inside the shop, Thomas inhaled the scent of old wood, dried herbs, and dust. Shelves were stocked with canned soup, winter boots, hunting gear, and a corner freezer humming faintly. A woman stood behind the counter. She was small-framed, somewhere in her early 50s, with chestnut hair pulled into a tidy bun. Her skin was pale but smooth, her eyes a soft hazel filled with curiosity more than judgment. She wore a knitted sweater in faded blue and simple jeans, giving her the gentle appearance of someone accustomed to quiet routines. Her name tag read Sarah O'Malley. Sarah greeted him with a warm nod. "Cold morning, isn't it? I haven't seen you around here before." Her voice was calm, steady, the kind that instantly eased the weight on a person's shoulders. Thomas adjusted his gloves. "Been gone a long time. Just came back yesterday." "To visit or to stay?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. "I suppose that depends on how things go." Before Sarah could reply, the store door opened and a gust of wind followed a tall man inside. Richard Crowley. He looked older than Thomas expected, but still carried the air of someone who believed the world owed him its attention. Richard had a long, angular face marked with lines of clenched ambition, a thick, dark coat buttoned to the collar, and short, silver-streaked hair slicked neatly. His jaw was squared, his eyes a piercing cold blue that rarely softened. He carried himself with the confidence of a man used to winning arguments, deals, and territories. His gaze landed on Thomas with a flicker of disbelief before shifting into a thin smile. "Well, the prodigal Marine returns." Thomas stared back calmly. "Morning, Crowley." Richard crossed his arms. "Didn't expect you to show your face around here after so many decades. I'm not here to stir anything up. Just fixing the old place." "You mean that collapsing shack on the edge of the river?" Richard smirked. "Let it go, Reed. Sell it. That spot isn't fit for anyone, especially someone your age." Sarah stiffened slightly at the counter, clearly uncomfortable hearing such sharp words directed at an elder. Thomas remained steady, expression unreadable. "I appreciate the concern, but I'll manage." Richard shrugged. "Suit yourself." He walked off without another word, his boots echoing heavily on the wooden floor. Sarah exhaled quietly. "Don't mind him. Richard has been trying to buy half this town for years." "I know the type," Thomas replied. He purchased supplies, thanked Sarah, and returned to Duke, who wagged his tail gently as Thomas approached. "You ready for the cold again, boy?" Duke let out a soft rumble of approval. They drove home as thin flakes of snow drifted from the sky. After unloading the supplies into the truck bed, Thomas decided to walk behind the cabin, exploring the woods that had once been his childhood playground. The path was faint, nearly erased by winter, but Duke led confidently with his nose close to the snow. The deeper they walked, the quieter the forest became. The trees stood tall like old watchers guarding secrets. Then Duke stopped. His ears shot forward, his body tensed, and a low whine vibrated through his throat. Thomas followed the direction of Duke's stare. Between two fallen pines lay a shape that blended almost perfectly with the snow. At first glance, it appeared like a shadow, but as Thomas stepped closer, the shadow trembled. It was a horse. Thin, ribs sharp beneath its coat, its mane tangled with ice, its legs stiff and trembling from exhaustion. The creature looked young but beaten by harsh seasons, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Its coat should have been a warm brown, but winter had dulled it into a washed-out color. Its eyes, however, held a gentle fire, as if refusing to surrender entirely. Thomas approached slowly, placing a hand out in front of him. Duke remained close, but his stance softened, sensing the creature meant no harm. "Easy now," Thomas whispered. The horse's breath released in fragile clouds. It blinked at him, not with fear, but with a pleading exhaustion that pressed against Thomas's chest better than any words. Thomas crouched beside it, the cold seeping into his knees. He examined the fallen branches trapping its hind legs. Nothing deadly, but enough to pin it in this freezing place for who knew how long. "You've been fighting to stay alive, haven't you?" Thomas murmured. The horse shifted slightly, as if answering. Thomas stroked its neck gently. Duke stepped closer and sniffed the snow near its muzzle. The horse let out a soft sound, a mixture of pain and trust, resting its head near Thomas's hand. A memory struck him suddenly. His father helping an injured stray dog behind the barn, whispering that every life deserved one more chance. Thomas felt a familiar ache rising in his chest. He stood and looked at Duke. "We're not leaving it here." Duke wagged his tail once, firm and decisive, as though he had expected Thomas to say exactly that. Snow began falling harder now, blanketing the scene in quiet urgency. Thomas brushed the horse's mane once more. "Hang in there. We're going to get you home." And as the winter wind swept through the trees, something stirred in Thomas's heart. A small spark born from compassion rather than memory. In the silence of the Minnesota forest, a retired soldier, his loyal dog, and a wounded horse formed the beginning of a bond neither of them had anticipated. The sky darkened early that afternoon, the clouds thickening into a heavy gray blanket that promised more snow before nightfall. Thomas Reed moved quickly through the forest path, his breath ghosting in the cold air as he carried the rope, a bundle of the last dried hay he had salvaged from the old barn, and a folded wool blanket that had once belonged to his mother. Duke trotted beside him, leaving firm paw prints in the fresh powder. The dog's ears were alert, but his tail swayed lightly, sensing that this journey carried a purpose his old heart understood. When they reached the trapped horse again, the creature remained where they had found it, exhausted, yet still watching them with a steady, dark gaze. Snowflakes had begun to settle on its mane. Thomas approached slowly, lowering his height to seem less threatening. "Easy, girl," he murmured. His voice, deep and rough from years of military command, softened in the presence of the vulnerable animal. Duke sat a short distance away, his large frame still, his amber eyes calm. The horse trembled but made no attempt to struggle. Up close, Thomas could see more clearly just how malnourished it was. Its ribs pressed sharply against the thin winter coat, and its legs showed signs of days spent trapped in the cold. But its eyes held something that stirred a faint ache in Thomas's chest. Defiance, a will to keep going, and perhaps a memory of a life before this winter storm had nearly taken it. "We will get you out," he said gently. He began removing the fallen branches, one at a time, careful not to startle the horse. The work was slow, methodical, and required him to brace his aging knees against the frozen ground. Duke occasionally stepped forward to sniff the air, tail lifting when he felt the horse relax, lowering again when Thomas paused to breathe. After clearing the obstruction, Thomas wrapped the blanket around the horse's back. The fabric was warm from his body heat, and when the wool touched the horse's ribs, it let out a soft, relieved sound. Thomas tied the rope around its torso in a secure but gentle loop. "We'll call you Hope," he whispered. The name fit perfectly. The horse blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the new identity. It took time, patience, and a few firm tugs on the rope, but eventually Hope pulled herself free. Her legs shook as she found her balance, and Thomas steadied her with both hands. "Easy now, one step at a time." Duke circled around, tail gently wagging, offering reassurance in the way only an old service dog could. With the daylight fading, Thomas guided Hope toward the cabin. The wind picked up, blowing sharp gusts that bit at their faces, but they pushed forward, moving slowly across the snow-blanketed ground. By the time they reached the house, the sky had turned a deep purple, the last light slipping behind the line of distant pines. The cabin itself was too damaged to offer shelter, but behind it stood the old root cellar, a door half hidden by frozen brush. Thomas had not set foot inside for decades. He cleared the entrance, lifted the creaking wooden door, and descended the short stone steps. The air inside was dry and still, holding the faint, lingering scent of grains his father once stored for winter months. "This will do," Thomas said quietly. He brought in a few planks of wood to build a barrier from drafts, then arranged the hay in a corner where Hope could lie down comfortably. The horse stepped inside with hesitation, but quickly seemed to understand the warmth the place offered. Thomas placed a hand on her neck and felt the trembling of cold begin to ease. When he lit a small fire in the metal basin near the far wall, the soft glow filled the room with gentle warmth. Duke curled beside Thomas, resting his head on his owner's boot. Thomas leaned back against the dirt wall, stretching his legs with a tired exhale. His hands still trembled slightly from the cold and effort, but his heart felt steadier than it had in years. Hope settled onto the hay, her breath forming soft clouds in the dim air. Occasionally she let out a weary sigh, the kind that sounded like gratitude. Thomas watched her for a long moment. Something in her calm, in the way she accepted help without fear, broke through the thick armor of grief he had carried since leaving this home. He thought of his father again, Samuel Reed, tall and broad-shouldered like Thomas, but with a gentler voice, a man who believed every creature deserved a second chance. Thomas had not understood those words when he was young. The military had trained him to focus on missions, on efficiency, on survival. But now, sitting in the glow of the fire with an old dog and a wounded horse forming a small circle of warmth around him, he finally felt the weight of what his father meant. Life was not just about fighting battles. Sometimes it was about returning quietly to the things that needed you. "We will rebuild," he murmured again, though this time he was not talking about the cabin. He was talking about something deeper. Hope shifted, resting her head near the firelight. Duke thumped his tail once in quiet agreement. Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest, an emotion he had nearly forgotten. Not joy, not yet, but the steady beginning of belonging. Outside, the wind howled across the snowfields, rattling the branches above the cellar door. But inside, protected by earth and stone, 3 weary souls rested together, bound by circumstance, survival, and the faint promise that tomorrow might be a little better than yesterday. For the first time in decades, Thomas did not feel alone. He felt needed, and for a man who had spent a lifetime giving everything to duty, that feeling of being needed was enough to keep him going into the long Minnesota winter night. The storm outside had softened into a fine silver mist, drifting across the snowy clearing like a veil drawn gently over the past. Beneath the old cabin, in the dim glow of the root cellar's firelight, Thomas Reed continued sorting through the forgotten storage shelves along the far wall. Dust clung to his gloves and rose in pale clouds each time he shifted an old crate or brushed aside dried pine needles. Duke lay near the warmth of the fire, his head resting on his paws, though his eyes followed every movement Thomas made. Hope, still weak but steadier than the night before, lifted her head from the nest of hay whenever Thomas moved too quickly, blinking her large, soft eyes as if trying to understand this strange new shelter. Thomas paused, stretching his tired back as his gaze fell upon a rusted metal box tucked beneath a cracked wooden step. It was small, the kind of tin box used decades ago to store valuables or private letters. The lid bore faint lettering worn by time, but he knew the shape of those letters as well as he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. Samuel Reed, his father's name. Thomas knelt slowly, brushing frost away with the back of his glove. The box felt colder than the ground itself when he lifted it into his hands. For a moment, he simply held it, feeling the weight of years settle into his palms. Duke sensed something change and rose, moving to sit beside him. Hope let out a quiet breath that fluttered the strands of hay near her nose. Thomas opened the box carefully. Inside lay 3 objects, arranged with a gentleness that startled him. A single envelope with his name written in his father's careful handwriting. A leather journal with pages yellowed by age, and a faded photograph sealed in a plastic sleeve. The photograph drew his attention first. He lifted it close to the firelight. There he saw himself as a child, no older than 8, standing between his parents. His father, Samuel Reed, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair and a trimmed beard. His features were rugged, but softened by a warm smile, his arm resting across Margaret Reed's shoulder. His mother was slender, with long brown hair braided neatly, her eyes kind and bright even in the faded print. And standing in front of their cabin, whole, proud, and alive, was the family Thomas had walked away from long before he understood the price of leaving. His throat tightened. The photograph trembled slightly in his fingers. Duke nudged his arm gently. Thomas inhaled deeply, then set the photograph aside and reached for the envelope. His hands shook as he slid a thumb beneath the aged flap and unfolded the paper within. The ink had faded but remained legible, carrying the quiet weight of a man who rarely spoke more than necessary, yet always meant every word. Tom, if you are reading this, it means you found your way home. We had our differences, and we may never have found the right words to mend them. But not a day passed when your mother and I were not proud of the man you became. Life can be harsh, son, but a home is not lost until the heart refuses to return. If the world has wounded you, then let this place be the first to forgive you. Love, Dad. The words blurred as Thomas blinked rapidly, fighting the sting behind his eyes. He pressed the letter against his chest and let out a long, trembling breath that echoed slightly against the cellar walls. He had waited his whole life for something like this, yet he had never expected it to arrive in silence. After both his parents were gone, for years Thomas had carried guilt like an invisible pack strapped across his shoulders. He had left home at 18 with harsh words spoken in anger, convinced he needed distance from his father's stern expectations. He never knew his father waited for him, believed in him, loved him quietly through every year of absence. The knowledge hit him harder than any battlefield memory. Duke pressed his head against Thomas's knee, offering comfort in the instinctive way only a loyal companion could. The dog's warm weight grounded him, drawing him back from the sharp edges of regret. Hope shifted her legs and released a gentle, almost sympathetic sound. Her eyes, reflecting the flickering firelight, carried no judgment, only a simple understanding shared by any creature that had endured hardship and chosen to trust again. Thomas wiped the corner of his eye with the back of his glove. "Your timing, Dad," he whispered, "still telling me what I need to hear." He placed the letter carefully beside the journal. With a slow breath, he opened the worn leather book. The handwriting inside was unmistakably his father's, strong strokes softened by time. The entries began years ago, filled with notes about the farm, the weather, the seasons, the small victories and losses of rural life. But as Thomas continued reading, the tone became more personal. His father wrote about missing Thomas, about the empty silence left in the house after he departed, about the hope that one day his son might walk up the old path again. He wrote of the pride he felt, hearing from neighbors that Thomas had joined the Marines, and later, when rumors circulated of his heroism overseas. The journal held no trace of resentment, only a quiet longing and steady love that Thomas had been too blind to see. The guilt returned with a sharpness that made his breath hitch, but beneath it there was something gentler, something he had feared he no longer deserved. Forgiveness. He closed the journal softly, holding it against his knee as though it might crumble if handled too roughly. Duke curled beside him, resting his chin across Thomas's boots. Hope lowered her head, her eyes half closed as though lulled by the warmth of the fire and the peace that had settled into the room. Thomas leaned back against the cellar wall and allowed the quiet to wrap around him. The cold outside remained fierce, but down here, beneath the earth, with two loyal companions and the words of a father who had never stopped believing in him, Thomas felt a warmth he had not known in years. He looked at the photograph again, then at Duke, then at Hope. His chest loosened. He finally understood something he had run from all his life. Life did not ask him to be perfect. It only asked him to come home. And he had. The last weeks of winter moved slowly across Cold River, drifting past the cabin like an old memory reluctant to leave. Each dawn arrived with a soft gray light that settled over the yard, where Duke patrolled with his usual calm diligence, and Hope grazed quietly near the remaining patches of hay. Thomas Reed rose early every morning, the stiffness in his shoulders and knees reminding him that 65 winters shape a man differently, but never weaken his resolve. With a steady rhythm born from years of military routine, he set about repairing the old cabin piece by piece. He reinforced the porch beams first, driving new nails into fresh timber with a strength that belied his age. His hands, calloused and powerful, moved with the precision of someone who had erected shelters under monsoon rains, desert winds, and battlefield nights where mistakes could cost lives. Here, though, the work felt gentler. Every plank he lifted, every hinge he tightened, became a quiet dialogue between him and the home his father once tended. Duke watched from nearby, occasionally trotting forward to investigate fallen wood chips or bark at a passing squirrel. Hope, steadily recovering, walked more confidently each day. Her once trembling legs grew stronger, her coat regaining a warmer sheen as the promise of spring approached. Sometimes she would wander close to Thomas, nuzzling her muzzle against his shoulder while he worked. He would pause and stroke her gently, murmuring encouragement. "You're doing well, girl. We all are." By late morning, Thomas always brewed a pot of strong coffee on the old stove he had finally managed to revive. As the steam curled upward, he carried the mug to the newly repaired front steps and stood there, taking in the stillness. Duke bounded across the snow-softened yard with bursts of puppy-like enthusiasm despite his age, and Hope grazed calmly near the fence line. These scenes, simple as they were, wrapped Thomas in a peace he had never allowed himself to imagine during his service years. He felt the ache of old memories, yes, but the cold edges had begun to warm. One afternoon, when the snow had thinned from thick blankets to delicate patches scattered across the earth, the sound of tires crunching on frozen gravel echoed through the quiet. Thomas put down his hammer and stepped off the porch. A sleek black pickup rolled to a stop in front of the property, and Richard Crowley climbed out. Richard wore a heavy wool coat over a tailored sweater, his silver-streaked hair combed carefully, his expression sharp as ever. His face, angular and rigid, seemed carved from decades of ambition and victory, the sort of man who disliked anything he could not control. His eyes traced the repaired beams, the tidied yard, the newly built fence rails. Then his gaze fell on Hope. "So you really mean to stay here?" Richard said, curling his lips slightly. "Living in a half-rebuilt shack with a crippled horse and an ancient dog?" Thomas chuckled, but there was no bitterness in the sound. It rolled from him with unexpected ease. "You see a shack?" he replied. "But I see a place worth starting again." Richard's jaw tightened. His confidence faltered for a moment, replaced by something almost wary. "You always were stubborn, Reed. Or maybe just patient," Thomas answered, resting a hand on Duke's back as the dog stood beside him. Duke released a short bark, sharp and clear, as if punctuating Thomas's words. For a brief second, Richard's expression softened, though not enough to be called kind. More like a man realizing he had misjudged something he thought he understood. Without another word, he climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving behind a swirl of dust and a silence that no longer felt lonely. As the days passed, winter surrendered to the first golden hints of spring. Snow melted into rivulets of clear water that trickled down the slope behind the cabin. Sunlight gleamed off the wet bark of the trees, and each morning Hope greeted the day with a quiet, confident whinny. Her eyes shone brighter. Her steps carried none of the trembling weakness she had once struggled against. Duke seemed younger, too, invigorated by her presence. Thomas sometimes watched the two animals playfully chase each other across the yard, and he felt a warm stirring inside him, a kind of renewal he had not known since he was a child, running barefoot through these same fields. On a mild April morning, Thomas finished painting a new wooden board he had carved by hand. The letters were bold, carved deep into the grain so they would withstand time and weather. "Reed Haven, a home for the weathered souls." He hung it above the doorway of the rebuilt cabin. When he stepped back, Duke stood beside him, tail swaying gently. Hope approached from behind, nudging Thomas's arm as if approving the sign. "Looks like a new beginning," Thomas whispered. Late that afternoon, while he was stacking logs beside the door, another truck approached the property. This one was older, faded blue, and carried patches of rust along the fenders. The driver stepped out slowly. He was a middle-aged man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a lean, tired face and a bit of stubble along his chin. His hair was sandy brown, beginning to thin near his temples. He wore a thick flannel jacket over a pair of worn jeans, and his boots were covered in dried mud. His shoulders slumped with a heaviness that came not from age, but from carrying too many quiet burdens. He removed his cap and held it nervously. "Afternoon. Name's Carl Bennett." His voice was rough, as if unused to asking anything of anyone. "I heard you. Help animals no one else will take." Thomas nodded, resting his hands calmly on his belt. "I do what I can." Carl swallowed hard. "I have an old dog. He's blind in one eye. Can't hunt anymore, and my landlord says I can't keep him. The shelter won't take a dog his age." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't know where else to go." Thomas exchanged glances with Duke and Hope, both of whom stood quietly at his sides. Then he stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Carl's shoulder. "You came to the right place," he said softly. "Bring him here. There's always room for anyone who's weathered a few storms." Carl let out a slow breath and nodded, relief loosening his tense posture. He stepped back toward his truck. Inside the cab, a large senior dog with graying fur lifted its head, ears drooping but eyes warm. As the evening sun cast a golden glow across the Minnesota horizon, Thomas, Duke, Hope, and their soon-to-be new companion stood before the cabin. The place no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. "Reed Haven," Thomas whispered, "open for all who need a home." Duke wagged his tail. Hope bowed her head gently. And with that, Reed Haven began its true purpose. A sanctuary for those who, like Thomas himself, had endured, survived, and were ready to feel whole again. In the quiet of Reed Haven, something larger than one man's effort had taken root. Thomas Reed thought he was simply rebuilding an old cabin, rescuing a wounded horse, and giving a forgotten dog a second chance. But he eventually realized he was witnessing something far greater. The gentle way in which God works through small moments, simple acts of kindness, and the fragile creatures placed in our path. Hope did not arrive with thunder or miracles wrapped in light. She came trembling in the snow, weak and barely standing. Yet through her, Thomas rediscovered forgiveness. Through Duke, he remembered loyalty. Through the old dog Carl brought, he learned compassion has no age limit. And through every sunrise over that humble home, he felt the quiet truth that God never abandons those who wander. He simply waits for them to turn back. Sometimes blessings don't come as answered prayers. Sometimes they come as wounded animals needing shelter. Sometimes as strangers who need a place to rest. And sometimes blessings come because we are finally ready to see them. Reed Haven became more than a cabin. It became a reminder that no soul is too old, too tired, or too broken for God to touch it gently and make it new again. And perhaps, dear viewer, this story is also a reminder for all of us. No matter how many winters your heart has survived, no matter how long you've carried your burdens, God still has ways to lead you home, heal your wounds, and fill your days with quiet grace. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Share a memory, share a prayer, or simply say hello. And if you believe in the power of second chances, of love returning in unexpected forms, please consider liking this video, sharing it so others may find comfort, and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss more stories of hope, faith, and healing. May God bless you, guard your home, warm your spirit, and send His light into every corner of your life. Amen.